Hello and welcome to Clue Awareness, Evidence, and Ground Search Theory, the second of the call-out qualified trainings for Oahu Search and Rescue. This PowerPoint covers basic clue awareness and evidence in the context of search and rescue. Materials for this presentation come from a couple different books. First, Introduction to Search and Rescue. Many of you have already read that and taken the SAR-TEC 3 test. The second is Fundamentals of Search and Rescue. Specifically from the Fundamentals of Search and Rescue, chapters 13 on tracking has elements in this particular PowerPoint, chapter 14 on search background and related issues, and chapter 15 on search operations. I should note, and I'll note again a little bit later, that tracking is an independent skill, and so we're not covering in any detail what's covered in the tracking chapter. But we will touch on some of the basics. Both of these books look at the search and rescue work that volunteers like you are doing and are both excellent resources. Additionally, in this PowerPoint, there are a variety of slides that have been incorporated from a slideshow entitled Introducing the Crucial Elements of Ground Search and Rescue for First Responding Teams. This is a PowerPoint put together by Paul J. Morris of the Harvard Fire Department and licensed under a Creative Commons Share and Share Alike license. To that end, this presentation is also licensed under the Creative Commons Share and Share Alike license. Also, thanks to Megan Huber, who put together the first version of this PowerPoint and led the first training last year on it. And finally, this PowerPoint does not cover tracker training, as I mentioned, which is a more advanced and separate training. So let's get into some of the topics that we'll be covering in this particular lecture. Generally speaking, we'll start with a review of incident command systems and basic search and rescue in the context of clue awareness. Much of this has been covered in the introduction to search and rescue, but it's worthwhile to go over it and to put it in the context of clue awareness. The other and bulk of the remaining part of this lecture is evidence and clues, clue awareness, clue orientation theory, types of clues, evidence processing, and chain of command. We'll also cover search skills, and then finally, and very briefly, we'll talk about what to do if one were to find a deceased person at a search and rescue scene, and finally, injuries that could potentially happen in SAR. So, to move into the basic review of incident command and the basics of search and rescue in the context of clue awareness. There are 7 crucial elements of search and rescue. These should be familiar to you by now. First, it is important to always keep in mind that search is an emergency. Second, that maximizing the probability of success in the minimum amount of time with the right resources is fundamental to search and rescue. It is also important to remember that search is a classical mystery. This becomes relevant for what we're doing here because clue awareness is part of trying to uncover the mystery of the lost person. Fourth, search for clues and the subject. In this particular lecture, we're going to talk in some detail about the clue aspect of search and rescue as much as looking for the subject, him or herself. Fifth, focus on aspects important to success. 6, know if the subject leaves the search area. Again, we'll cover containment again here because it's a fundamental component of search and rescue, but also of clue awareness and making sure that you're looking for somebody in the right part of the area. And finally, use tight grid search as a last resort. We'll be coming to what a tight grid search is versus other forms of search momentarily. Some of these unified command structures may look familiar to you by this point. These are 2 possible versions of an incident command structure for a search and rescue event. Notice that both start with an incident command that is a unified command. Generally speaking, if a search and rescue team is brought into a search, it will be in conjunction with the police department and or the fire department. And so a search and rescue incident commander would be part of an incident command unified command. Most important for our purposes within this particular PowerPoint are looking at the roles that operations, planning, investigation, and to some degree logistics play. Obviously, in smaller searches, as we've talked about before, some of these roles can be condensed. Notice that in these two versions of an incident command structure, investigation is a different point on the chart. In one version, the investigation unit comes under planning, and this is certainly well within the realm of what we may consider doing. In the other version, investigation is a separate entity from planning. Again, much of this will have to do with resources and who's available to do what kind of jobs as we go about looking at an incident. Let's break this down a little bit further as we're thinking about incident command in the context of a search. General goals of any search and rescue are to find the missing person, and secondly, to ensure that everyone comes home safe. The objectives are more applicable to the specifics of the search. In this case, find out where to search, find out what clues to look for, contain the search area, search high risk and high probability areas. And again, we'll come back to what high risk and high probability areas look like, but it's always important to keep that in mind when structuring the directions to give to people going out into the field. When looking at the difference between operation, planning, and investigation, you can see from here that there are specific items that these particular organizational units will be engaged in from the beginning. Operations from the beginning would be primarily responsible for protecting the point last seen. That's what PLS means. Briefing resources being those who are going to go out in the field for reflex tasks. We often refer to reflex tasks as hasty search teams. Planning, in the meantime, we'll be looking at the weather forecast, identifying the high-risk areas that may need more immediate attention. They'll be planning the containment strategy, and again, we'll be talking about what that means in a second. And they'll be the ones planning future reflex tasks or hasty searches. Meanwhile, and simultaneously, and working in conjunction with planning, the investigation unit will be looking into the specifics of the missing individual. Who's missing? Where might they be? A description, a photo, etc. We'll be talking about the lost person questionnaire in a little bit, as well as lost person behavior as elemental in the beginning of structuring search theory and clue awareness. And finally, from the perspective of this particular kind of scenario, a logistics person would be responsible for assuring that everybody has the appropriate maps, putting together the command post, communications plans, making sure that the appropriate paperwork is available to be used. There are some general guidelines to any missing person response, and here we have the basic steps leading up to and completing any search and rescue mission. The first phase is the pre-planning phase, where incident command is set up and the units within incident command begin to develop the information relevant for implementing a search. Notification is for the resources and everyone to appear on the scene. The initial response, these would be the initial tasks, possibly happening for the first 3 hours, are those that get the search underway immediately, while the first operational period and subsequent operational periods are planned and implemented. Finally, and hopefully with the successful conclusion of a search, the suspension of a search occurs, and then there ought to be a critique component where everyone debriefs about what has happened, what can be done better in the future. Remember, when planning for a search, that search is an emergency. So responding urgently is important. Again, it's important to respond safely, but to always keep in mind that there's an urgency to a search. We'll come back to areas of containing the search, and again, I mentioned that that's an important one, but I wanted to spend specific time on don't stop at night as a component of search is an emergency. Searching at night has its own dangers, especially here in Hawaii. So such a decision to search at night needs to be balanced with the search urgency. So remember that one of the initial things that has to happen upon hearing about a search and rescue incident is that there needs to be a determination of the search urgency, and the safety of the searchers needs to be considered as well. Additionally, the resources available will make a difference in the decision to search at night. If there are only a few people who are able to search, then it would not be safe to have them searching throughout the night without any relief. However, if there are ample volunteers and the terrain is such that danger is not a prominent threat to the searchers, then continuing the search at night may be relevant given the potential urgency of finding the lost person. So it's important to not just look at "don't stop at night" and think that that's what has to happen, but instead to consider what it means to search at night within the circumstances of a given search. Let's go over a couple relevant SAR terminology before we move on. The first is the last known position or the last known point. This is the last known location for the missing subject as determined by the physical evidence that we have to point us in the specific direction. That could include some kind of discarded object. It may be the vehicle that was left in a parking lot or locked into a parking lot, or it could be a footprint. Knowing the last known point or position is an important part of establishing the beginning point of any search and rescue. The point or place last seen may be the same as the last known point, but it may also be different. The location where the missing subject was actually seen by another person would be considered the point last seen. So, for example, someone may have got out of their car to go on a hike, which is the last known position in terms of the physical evidence, but a person might have seen them down the trail going in a specific direction, and that could be the point last seen. So these are the places where law enforcement would start to look for clues. If you are the first on the scene, it's important to protect the last known point or the point last seen, because these can be of utmost importance when authorities arrive, because this will be the starting point for determining what clues are available for searching for the individual. Two other important components of searching are the lost person questionnaire and the lost person behavior analysis. The lost person questionnaire is one that some of you have already become familiar with. We've utilized it in many of our training scenarios. The lost person questionnaire is an important part of the information needed when gathering clues, because much of this information can be derived beforehand and can help narrow the search area. So think about what needs to be figured out when doing a lost person questionnaire. This can provide the search managers with details on the clothing, equipment, medical conditions, place last seen, and context, etc. But it also can help us understand better what category the person fits into, and this will be important when we get to the lost person behavior, because a child behaves differently in the woods than a hunter or a camper or a hiker or somebody who's out taking nature photography. So the kind of category a person fits in can be identified on the lost person questionnaire and then combined with lost person behavior analysis to give us a sense of where that person may have ended up. Second, the lost person questionnaire is important in identifying and studying the point last seen, and it may help us uncover important clues there. Investigating the circumstances of the loss of the subject can also indicate where he or she started from, where he or she is going, or how he or she got there. And so interviewing a variety of people who may have information about the circumstances of the loss of the subject is important. If it's a group of hikers and some of them came back and some didn't, it would be important to interview the hikers who came back out of the woods. Or if somebody went out hiking after work, it may be important to interview their workmates to see when they left. Another important characteristic that can be identified from the lost person questionnaire is the physical and mental health or the general condition of the subject. This can help identify whether the search is urgent or more important because of the mental health issues or physical abilities of the lost subject. The subject's personality can also be a factor in determining how he or she might handle certain situations, and therefore it can be an indication of how they might act in the woods. So if somebody is easily defeated and depressed, they may be less likely to be resilient when lost in the woods than somebody who's more likely to be a self-rescuer. Equipment that the subject is carrying may not only help indicate his or her skill level, but it can also be a clue if it's dropped or lost by a subject. I just met two hikers and climbers the other day who had been given bad information about a hike. They'd been told that it was a 10-minute hike, easy hike to the top, and that they wouldn't need to worry too much about gear or clothing. So they'd left their backpack with all of their clothing and equipment at the base of this last little scramble, only to find out that the scramble up was much more technical than they thought, and they ended up being lost without any of their gear. There's a lot going on in that particular scenario, including the fact that their backpack was left at the bottom of a scrambling trail. So potential future searchers, if they had been able to recover that backpack, could have helped identify and figure out where the lost people had gone. Terrain is also an important indicator of where or how a subject may travel. It is also an indicator of how long the subject may survive. So when doing the lost person questionnaire and thinking through where they are, thinking about the terrain is important. Lost person behavior is an equally important component of an initial part of a ground search. There's a lot to learn about lost person behavior, and there's an entire literature on this subject for those who are interested in enhancing their skills here. Specifically, I've read Robert Koster's book, Lost Person Behavior, a search and rescue guide on where to look for land, air, and water, and it is an excellent resource. Koster is a Type 1 incident commander and instructor for the Virginia Department of Emergency Management. Using data collected from the International Search and Rescue Incident Database, ISRID, Koster has used statistical analysis of existing incidents to provide characteristics for different types of lost individuals and their probable behavior. It is important to remember that while we can call this searching for a quote-unquote lost person, the person themselves may not consider themselves lost. A SAR event may be triggered not by the lost individual, but by friends or family who report that individual has not returned at an agreed-upon hour. While from a SAR perspective, this may be the same. Recognizing that a lost person may not technically be lost is important and is a justification for why containment of the search becomes relevant again. So both the lost person and lost person questionnaire and the lost person behavior are central to setting up a successful search and sending searchers in the right direction. Take a few moments, if you will, to look at this particular scenario. You can pause the video to do so. Given the last lost person questionnaire, what additional questions would you ask? Who would you ask, and how would you ask these questions? Specifically here, it's important to remember that different information will come from different people. So don't expect to get a full story by interviewing just one person. If you have access to a variety of people who can provide information about both the hikers who are lost in this case, as well as the scenario itself, then you should try to interview them. It's also important when interviewing individuals that you remember to be serious and courteous, not to joke, certainly not to joke inappropriately, to be detailed and thorough so that the person being interviewed may not realize they have relevant information unless they're asked directly. So you need to make sure that you ask directly for information, but also to try to avoid asking leading questions. So lost person behavior has some interesting things to tell us about where we might begin to look for individuals. This graph provides some of the lost person behavior characteristics discussed by Koster. I've included it to demonstrate a few points. First, while we know that staying put, or hugging a tree, is an important aspect of being found, most subjects do not stay put, but they tend to be on the move. Second, based upon the data from prior incidents, again this is based on the ISRID, different people will be found further from the initial planning point, and the initial planning point tends to be the last known point, than others. Thus, when defining a search area, knowing something about the type of lost person and their possible behavior can help define how that search area will be created. Note, for example, that a snowmobiler, this is the snowmobiler here, someone will not be looking for, of course, in Hawaii, tends to move much further than climbers. Climbers are down here. Obviously, this has something to do with the type of activity in which they're engaged. Note also that children tend to be on the move more than other categories. This is another view of lost person behavior in terms of movement. This graph helps clarify the possible distance traveled by a lost person. Again, note that there's a wide range in terms of possible distance traveled by lost persons that may be relevant when setting up your search area. Note also that in terms of probabilities, 70% of people were found within a 2-mile radius. Now, this is still 12 square miles of search area, but it's better than trying to do a 10-mile radius or 314 square miles of search area. So the likelihood of detection within that specific radius changes depending on who you are looking for. Here's another way to look at this data, at least for temperate and non-mountainous conditions, which of course are not particularly the conditions that we'll be used to here in Hawaii. Please note that the following distances in Hawaii will be quite different. According to William Styrotuck in Analysis of Lost Person Behavior and Aid to Search Planning, which is another resource to use when looking at lost person behavior, quote, "It is more important to realize that a known percentage of all lost persons is found within a 1 or 2 mile radius than it is to know how they got there. For example, one hunter walked about 9 miles, but when found was only about 2.2 miles from the point last seen," unquote. And this is also an important point, that while the hunter or hiker or climber could be wandering literally in circles, they ultimately, at least statistically, end up almost no further than 2 miles from their starting point. Hikers usually rely on trails and have some destination in mind. These are characteristics to keep in mind if you're looking for a hiker. Many who have become lost, hikers that is, have inadequate maps or none at all. They run into navigational problems when trail conditions change. Examples of conditions changing: portions of the trail are obliterated, detours around slides get people off trail, old trails that are not maintained, and poorly defined trail junctions. We know from firsthand experience that sometimes going out on a trail can look much different than coming back. If large sectors of the trail are covered with snow or rock here, perhaps not often snow, then a straggler trying to catch up or a person who turns back will have difficulty linking up with the trail on the other side. Many hiking parties have only one person who is well versed with the map or the destination. This circumstance leaves the rest of the party inclined to follow the leader, a very unhealthy situation for the subject who becomes separated from the party. Some of the most tragic deaths in the data have resulted from a common and overlooked fault, that of mismatched abilities. So hikers that go out with some people being physically fit and well adapted to the wilderness and others not, and the others that are not get left behind, not intentionally, and then get lost. The individual who falls back because he cannot keep up becomes exhausted, then separated from the party, and finally lost. That was a quote from William Styrotuck's Analysis of Lost Person Behavior. In the data, 29% of hikers were found within a radius of 1 mile, which is positive. It means that they haven't got too far from the original point of last seen. 89% went downwards, which is interesting. 7% went upwards, and 4% were on the same level. So again, in terms of lost person behavior, hikers will behave differently than others. Compare that data to the data that Styrotuck has on miscellaneous outdoor persons. These are people like berry pickers or nature photographers who don't mean to go very far. In these cases, 37% were found within a 1 mile radius. So more of them were found within a 1 mile radius than those of the hikers. 17% went upward, which is a sizably larger number than 7%. 66% went downward, and 17% were found at the same level. So they behaved relatively differently than the hikers, even though you could argue that they were experiencing the same lost condition. So knowing a little bit more about the statistical probabilities of a given kind of lost person can help refine the search area and how large to draw that area. So again, these are probabilities, they're not absolutes, but it's important to keep this information in mind when beginning to implement a search. And again, before you send anyone out to start looking for anybody. Which brings us again to the notion of confinement. This graphic demonstrates a potential logic for the confinement in an area. If the last time somebody saw the lost person at the point last seen, which is the center of this particular map, was 3 a.m., and the time it now is 9 a.m., there's a theoretical search radius of 12 to 18 miles. This gives us quite a bit of territory to begin to look for. However, again, remembering that people may not necessarily know they're lost, or if lost, may be trying to find the best route out, confinement is an essential part of a search. Confinement can include roadblocks, lookouts, trail patrols, road patrols, and or track traps. And track traps is just a way of trying to capture information and find out if you can get a track from somebody. So let's look at this particular map. In this case, the point last seen for Timmy is identified with the PLS mark. Sending out a hasty task force or task team along the power line indicated that they found Timmy's hat right about where the big picture of the hat is. This helps us. This gives us some clues of direction of travel. Timmy is fairly young, and so that helps establish the dispersion area as well. And searchers can identify the search area with some probability. And so instead of the massive circle like we saw here, in this particular search, we have a very different search radius. And we can limit, at least initially, our search to these directions based upon the location of the clue found by the hasty searchers. Initial priorities for first responders involved in a search incident is to protect the last known point. Every incident has criminal potential, and so it's important to treat such a point as a crime scene until notified otherwise. Procedures should be followed to minimize any problem. And again, in virtually all scenarios, Oahu Search and Rescue will not be the first on the scene, and so there will be already, one would hope at least, protections in place. As the information about the lost person develops, there's a distinction that can be made between planning data and search data. Without substantial information, the planners cannot justify any strategies, and without planning and search data, it's like asking searchers to go out and search for anyone, any person, without any information. So in this case, search data is derived from planning data, but both are important for the elemental beginnings of the search. So again, searching is a classic mystery. That it means that there's an investigation component of the search, interviews, timelines of events, subject profiles. This should be ongoing or initially going while plannings and operations are thinking about safety and thinking about protocols for sending people on hasty searches. Clues, what kind of search data is out there, include things like clothing, equipment, litter. It can include the name description, footprints if possible, or scent articles if dogs are available. Planning data would be what places to look. Where was the subject last? What were they doing? All of these things should be covered in the initial briefing, and we'll talk a little bit more about the briefing as it relates to clues in a moment. There's a classic graphic that helps to describe this, and that's the reflex action along the bicycle wheel. This is a useful tool for considering how best to set up the hasty reflex actions portions of the search, and it is used, and it has the following elements. The axle, which is in the middle, is the initial planning point. The wheel, so the outside, is the containment area. The hub, which is this small area in here in blue, is the immediate search area, so the 25% ring, the 25% probability ring. The spokes in this particular visual are trails, possible paths that the hiker could have taken. And the reflectors are hotspots. These are places a lost person might most likely be found. High probability. This is another way to visualize some of that information. High probability areas, which could include trails, and these would be the hasty tasks to send people out to look on those, and high risk. In this case, it would appear that the high risk area is a swamp. So again, if we looked at the bicycle wheel, here's how we would look at it from a search and rescue perspective. We've secured the point last seen That's the investigation. This is the confinement circle. Hasty tasks along these hubs are likely routes to send individuals on. We've got man trackers and tracking dogs in this 25% circle. And finally, we have hasty tasks that are going to points of high risk and high probability. Let's dig down a little bit more into the idea of evidence and clues. First, let's talk about the briefing process. The best way to handle evidence is to have planned for its discovery. And that happens in the pre-planning period and the planning period, and then needs to be communicated to searchers during a briefing. Briefings are given by a member of the incident management or incident command, and they should include information such as the situational status, the subject information, so information about the subject, the terrain in the area, hazards to expect, and how to deal with any clues that are found. After this briefing, if you still have questions, then you should ask them. It's the searcher's responsibility to ask standard questions as well as search-specific questions. As noted in the Fundamentals of Search and Rescue, quote, "Since evidence can take so many forms, instructions on how to handle it should cover all the possibilities, leaving very little to chance. Handling clues and evidence can be the single most important part of the investigation of an incident, and therefore may weigh heavily on its outcome." Page 235. So again, if not told about the specifics of how to handle the evidence, then ask. Here are some questions to ask about clues if you were to find clues while searching. First, how should you record them? Should you sketch them? Should you photograph them? Should you write up a narrative about them? If you photograph them, it would be useful to photograph at least 3 different angles on them. Second, how do you protect them? Or do you need to protect them? Do you tape them off? Do you cover them? Do you cast them? Do you stay there with them and guard them? Are there additional resources coming that can take care of it? Third, how do you act upon the interpretations of the finding? Do you report it? Do you wait for instructions? To what extent should you act upon a clue? This should be covered in the briefing before you go out in the field. Fourth, what as a searcher should you do when confronted with 2 trails? This could be part of a clue. Do you act as you see fit? Do you divide your team up? Do you wait for instructions? And finally, if the clue is an item that may have been discarded by the subject, what do you do? Do you note the location? Do you mark it clearly? Do you leave it in place? Do you collect it? These are all decisions that should be identified and communicated to searchers before they go into the field. If they're not, by the time you find a clue, then communicate with Incident Command to identify how you should deal with them. Clues are important because they can provide a variety of things. They can provide a direction of travel. They can provide new last known points. They can shift the priority of the search area and where to search. So for example, if a search has been ongoing and new information comes in from a witness who saw the person in a different part of a state park, that can shift the focus of the search to the last known point. Clues can be footprints, like we see here. Clues can be candy wrappers. Clues can be environmental disturbances. So someone's walked through this grass and has kind of left something, really left a sign that somebody has come through here. In the grass photo above, can you see it? So why do we search for clues? Taylor and Cooper in Fundamentals of Man Tracking state, a walking person leaves a sign approximately every 18 to 20 inches, or 3,000 times per mile. So catching even a small percentage of it shouldn't be much trouble. The problem lies not in finding signs, but in determining which is relevant and which is not. While these clues might seem obvious, it can take an experienced and professional tracker to read and follow such a trail. Most untrained searchers are just walking through the area looking for the subject, oblivious to their surroundings. This is not what we should do.
So developing your search skills means being able to notice when things are out of place and deviate from the normal. Exploring the possible types of clues that a person could leave in the Hawaii wilderness is part of this skill set, and it can't be learned overnight, which means that we need to practice. Searches can be complicated if searchers are unaware of what clues to look for and or are unaware of how to look for those clues. Most importantly, be aware of your surroundings. The level of clue awareness separates untrained searchers from trained searchers who will know how to utilize clue awareness skills. Those who are aware, for example, will avoid walking on tracks and disturbing any potential clues. Searchers for Oahu Search and Rescue should have training and experience to understand the importance of clues to the overall search effort, why we focus search efforts for clues and not specifically the subject, which clues could possibly be found that could be associated with a lost person, how, when, and where to search in an area, how to handle clues once found, the importance of searching at night, which we already talked about a little bit, and the lack of clues, that means it's also a clue. Just to fill in a little bit about this, the focus on efforts for clues and not specifically the subject is relevant because the subject is an end goal, but there are lots of smaller clues that can help us identify where that subject might be. This is part of clue orientation. Clue orientation theory is the ability to logically theorize the correlation of a clue to a lost person in a methodical approach. Use of this theory is a learned skill that comes with practice and training. There are three elements to clue orientation: the sensor, the clue generator, and the environment. The sensor is the searcher. As fundamental of search and rescue notes, to detect clues, searchers must be able to detect what they seek when given a detection opportunity. This requires that they know what to look for, i.e. potential clues, and know what to do when they find it. This is accomplished through training and practice. When a clue is discovered, searchers must know exactly what to do about it. Ideally, this should be determined during the assignment briefing prior to entering the field. That's from page 226. They go on. Untrained, fatigued, or distracted searchers are less likely to discover clues. So stay alert, keep talking to a minimum so that you can hear possible sounds as well as stay focused on looking. The subject, the clue generator, is the second element here. Knowing about this individual can also change the search. They may start a fire or use some other method of attempting to signal for help. They may also leave very little in the way of traces. From the fundamentals of search and rescue again, human subjects leave predictable clues. Virtually every person who moves through an area leaves thousands of pieces of evidence of his or her passing: tracks, scent, discarded material, etc. Thus, the most common problem is not a lack of clues, but too many of them and distinguishing between which are relevant and irrelevant. A detailed subject profile can enable both searchers and managers to either relate a particular clue to a subject or discount it altogether. So again, working on that initial lost person questionnaire and using lost person behavior can help identify what are important clues and what are not. So for example, if you know that your individual only eats fruits and nuts, it's unlikely that they're going to have dropped a candy bar wrapper. Finding that kind of detail might be important for knowing what are clues and what's just litter. The environment is the third element here, and the environment and the prevailing conditions can be important to clue detection. Weather, terrain, obstacles can change the possibilities of clues being detected. We're going to come back to that in a little bit as well. So there are a series of clue categories to keep in mind. There are physical clues. These are footprints, broken brush, gum or candy wrappers, articles dropped by the subject, human waste, clothing, sounds, smells, anything that could be considered physical evidence. Backpacks, bags, a broken cell phone. There's recorded or documentary clues. Many wilderness areas, though not typically in Hawaii, have a trail register signature where somebody can identify when they went onto a trail. A written itinerary can be given to family or friends. A route can be marked on a trail map. There could be, if the individual lost is despondent, a suicide note. There are clues that are testimonial in nature. These are the interviews that would be conducted with witnesses, work colleagues, family and friends, anyone with information. It could be investigation findings, it could be health history of the individual, and it can be testimonial-wise the point last seen. There are also categories of events. This would be reporting hearing a call for help, or seeing flashing lights, or calls for help, again, or smell of smoke. And then finally there are analytical clues, the result of reasoning. These are thinking about where and how the individual might have traveled. So, if traveling from point A to point B, they would have had to go through point C, it'd be likely that you should send somebody to look at point C. It's important to keep in mind that clues have a lifespan depending on weather and terrain. They don't last forever. So wind can move clues, it can cover clues with debris, it can mask the sounds, it can disperse scent. Rain can destroy tracks and flood areas. Frost, ice, and snow can either highlight or hide clues. It can hold on to clues for a longer period of time, but only periodically expose them to view. Heat can melt or evaporate clue. It can also ultimately decompose something, which cause it initially to smell, but then those smells will go away. So time becomes the searcher's worst enemy. Evidence, as part of looking for clues, can be physical or incorporeal. Physical evidence are those things that are tangible, things that you can touch, like gum wrappers. The incorporeal is information or knowledge, things that you need to ask people about. Physical evidence has more weight with authority and is more desirable. So whenever possible, the goal is to take this kind of evidence, the intangible evidence, and convert it into physical evidence, either by taking a photo or writing it down as testimony. Importantly, when processing evidence, you need to know how to deal with it. The discovery of clues must be interpreted, reported, and acted upon, but if you locate the subject or solve the mystery, clues must be handled in a way that facilitates search efforts and investigation. So knowing how to handle evidence will be important in helping us interact with authorities like the HPD. So when you find a clue, take a waypoint of it, communicate the information to incident command, flag the location, and possibly remain on the scene until instructed to move on. Ideally, the recording and documentation of a clue and its surroundings should be of such quality that the entire scene could be reenacted or reproduced. The scene should be recorded so well that what went on before, during, and after the discovery of a particular piece of evidence can be accurately relived. This can be difficult when evidence is intangible and difficult to preserve. The recording of the event, i.e. the photo, notes, sketches, etc., becomes the physical evidence. So the more thorough the recording of the evidence, the better the evidence. So turning intangible clues into physical evidence takes the following kinds of steps. First, take notes. Ideally, the entire scene can be reproduced and relived. Document the placement of clues and facts in the surrounding scene. Leave nothing to the imagination and use plain English. Stick to the facts as much as possible, and as much as possible be able to corroborate them. It is guaranteed that somebody will need you to walk through what was found. Think about this step as writing down everything you know about the situation, and remember that every clue may become evidence and that every incident has the potential to be a criminal case. Second, sketch the scene, if possible. Draw diagrams and pictures of objects involved at the scene and relative position. Third, take photographs. This is an excellent way to document the scene. Photograph at least 3 sides of the object. 4 would be better. Photograph at a zoomed out angle, and then zoom in to get different kinds of perspectives. Fourth, corroborating witnesses. Get information from others who saw what you saw, or anything at all. Fifth, retrieve and preserve. If it is within the scope of the briefing, collect the clues. This is the ultimate goal. Certain evidence must be collected or recorded immediately. Otherwise, it might not be there when others arrive. Turning intangible clues into physical evidence and then putting that evidence into a chain of evidence is important. So once collected, the evidence is not allowed out of your possession until it can be given to an equally responsible person or a person in authority. Any opportunity for alteration of evidence by natural or human causes reduces the credibility of that evidence in a case. Any SAR scene where evidence is found is considered a crime scene until proven otherwise. So handling the evidence correctly is important. So when we're looking for clues, it's important to be attentive to details. Look up, look down, look forward, look back. Take your time and focus. Be observant. Know the environment. Know yourself and your limitations. And use all your senses. Listen, smell, be thoughtful. In the 3 chevron signs to the right, which one is not like the other? This is a matter of being slightly observant. In this photo, what do you see? This photo indicates everybody's looking off to the right. There's something very interesting over there. But as they're looking off to the right, they're missing something fairly critical and important from a search and rescue angle. Can you see what that is? Sight and distractions can be relevant during a search. Looking at different particular distances can mean overlooking potential clues. So in this particular photograph, we're drawn to the sign on the 35 mile per hour, and in the process may miss something else, like this wallet sitting right here. Looking to see if something fits the surroundings is also an important component of clue awareness and clue searching. In this case, there's a stick that could be a walking stick lying next to some trees where this otherwise are holding up a tree. It doesn't quite fit. The color of clothing and its blending with the environment is also a reason to keep in mind that things might be difficult to see. In this case, the camouflage clothing is much more difficult to see than the black jacket across the tree limb. Lighting will also change access to clues. In the next 4 photos, you'll see how the lighting makes an item easier or harder to see. In this case, the black plastic bag is relatively easy to see. As the light changes, so does the visibility of the bag. In the dark, the bag is virtually invisible and much more difficult to see. And in true night, it's impossible to see. Another important aspect of searching is listening. Stop, listen, and call. It's very important when engaged in a search to listen as much as to look. This should be done intentionally. To effectively listen, stop or pause so that you are still. Listen, then call. Then wait to hear a response before moving on. Conversation among team members may drown out the sound of calls, so keep conversation to a minimum when engaged in any kind of search. The sounds of hiking may also mask sounds, so it's important to stop and listen. We're not covering much in terms of tracking, but possible clues can be shoe tracks, and so it's useful to know what some of those look like. Hiking boots, running shoes. What's this one? In Hawaii, we have a lot of people that wear microspikes, so identifying microspikes would be a useful thing. One of the ways in which you can record shoe tracks is using a brief outline like this. Drawing a footprint, particularly complete and identifiable one, can help others know what print to seek. So this is a blank sketch. One can also take a photograph of it. This is another common sole that you might find in Hawaii. So let's talk a little bit about search tactics. Search tactics are the probability of detection, the probability the subject or clue will be located in an area. It's important to be realistic about the probability of detection. There are a few different ways to look at search tactics: critical separation, purposeful wandering, and grid searching. Critical separation is twice the average distance at which a person or object can just barely be seen. To consider when searching: attention to task, speed, lighting, sunglasses and sunlight will affect what you can see, spacing, the thoroughness of coverage, fatigue, which will change your ability to see, and being open-minded to size, color, and other variations. Critical separation as a distance means that you shouldn't all be searching in one group if the terrain allows, but to be separated to cover more territory. Purposeful wandering is an important element of a search. We'll talk a little bit about this in the context of loose grid searches, but deviating from your track to inspect areas of interest is fairly important. Looking under bushes, behind rocks, because again, a view from one angle will be very different from what it looks like from a different angle. Look around trees and behind trees. Look up, look down, and look behind you. So here's a rock. It looks fairly innocuous. There's nothing to be seen. But on the back side of that rock is this red clothing item. It would be hidden unless you went around the back to look. Here are some other common visuals for looking for clues. There's a bit of a footprint on this leaf here that could be useful. Can you tell what kind of shoe might have made that? This rock is indented. What does that tell us about what's happened here? What about the differences in color in this photo? The green and the brown. Is this of use to us in terms of evidence? And here, can we tell anything about what might have happened from the tracks in the grass? When searching an area, it's important to divide that area up into different sectors instead of trying to search the entire area at once. Here's a nice graphic that demonstrates how one might want to divide such an area. Notice that area C has much steeper inclines than some of these other areas, and thus is much smaller to a certain degree, though F is also fairly small. So there's a couple different types of searches when engaged in more sophisticated post-hasty team searches. And there are a few different definitions to keep in mind for grid searches. First is the baseline. The baseline is a line starting the grid search. It runs perpendicular to the direction of travel on which the searchers line up. Second is the guideline. This is a control line, the direction in which a searcher looks for guidance as to the status of the search line. So if this is our baseline, then our guideline, we'll see in the next picture a little bit clearer, is where we're going, up this direction. There's a guide person. This person who guides the search team. They're found either at the base, they can be found in the right, they can be found in the center. The guide person is the person around which the rest of the search team orients. The search line is an area an individual searcher is assigned to scan. So each one of these is a search line. And then finally, there can be a trail tape or string line. And this can be a way of indicating where a line is when there is no natural line. In the loose grid search that you see here, search teams may consist of 3 to 7 persons, but usually just 3 because of the ease of team coordination with fewer people. The goal of this technique is to cover larger geographic areas quickly and with fewer resources. The trade-off, however, is low overall coverage, so less thoroughness, and the benefit is that it allows some reasonable level of coverage to be spread over a large area in a relatively short time. When a life depends on searching a very large area and there is no evidence strongly favoring one region over another, lower coverage in assignments may be better than no coverage in some to achieve higher coverage in others. That's coming from the fundamentals of search and rescue. So a team conducting a loose grid search would look like this. They'd organize a baseline, which is a line perpendicular to the direction of travel on which the searcher is lined up. The spacing between the searchers would depend on the terrain and visibility. Generally, in a loose grid, there should be minimal overlap between the search lanes. Notice in this graphic that there's not much overlap at all in the search lanes. Team members should maintain occasional visual and voice contact with one another, but this is not mandatory. Effective loose grid searches do not require all searches to remain in line with each other. So this is a form of purposeful wandering, starting from a similar baseline and going in a similar direction to cover a general area relatively efficiently. To quote from Fundamentals of Search and Rescue, once a baseline and guide for the search is established, the segment is divided into an appropriate number of search lanes based on the number of searchers, search speed, the amount of time assigned for the task, usually that will be less than 6 hours, and the size of the segment. The goal of the team should be to finish their assigned task in the time allotted. If a loose grid search is assigned, it usually means that the team will have to move quickly over the segment. In carrying out a loose grid search, the team should not attempt to spend a great deal of time conducting a very thorough search. Thoroughness is not a characteristic of a loose grid search. Again, it's trying to cover a broad amount of space in a relatively quick amount of time. This is another version of what a loose grid search might look like. In this graphic, the guide is center, while along both sides, people engage in a loose sweep. Once the search lanes are established, individual searchers should weave throughout their search area, sometimes looking backwards again, sometimes looking up. Again, remember the concept of purposeful wandering. Individuals should not only cover their assigned lane, but they should also move laterally to look behind obstructions and investigate likely looking spots based on the information available. As a last result, tight grid searches may be used. A tight grid search is slower and very systematic. It is generally used when needing high coverage of a specific search area. Searchers line up along the baseline, usually relatively close in terms of spacing. They should proceed along straight, parallel, and equally spaced tracks, at least as much as allowed by the terrain and vegetation. So before using a tight grid search, you should consider the following. This type of searching is destructive to clues if they're not found. In fact, it ensures that they'll never be found. Thus, it should be used as a last resort. It is slow and takes a lot of resources. Those may not be the most effective use of time and resources in the early stages of a search. Grid searches also take a great deal of effort in coordinating searches and the movement and maintaining appropriate formation. Going back to our topographical map, here's some visuals of how you might search a specific area based on the terrain and based on a loose search. Coming to the last elements of this particular lecture, let's talk briefly about injuries in search and rescue. The treatment of a serious injury and alleviation of pain supersedes the collection of evidence. Then, once the treatment is complete, remember that an investigation may still hinge on any clues and the recollection of those involved. Of course, being able to treat an injury suggests that we've found the lost person, and that would be very positive. However, if the person's not injured, it is useful to know what to do if you encounter the deceased or a deceased person at a search and rescue team. From the fundamentals of search and rescue, discovery and investigation of serious injuries and accidental death can be the least enjoyable part, but most important aspect of search and rescue. And there are some general guidelines to help search and rescue personnel when responding to the scene of a deceased. First, medical care. The first on the scene must provide medical care above all else. So the first question to ask is the person dead or deeply injured? Second, observe the scene. Are there any clues that might be blown away by the wind or get destroyed by imminent weather? So observe and make sure that the clues are there or can be secured. Third, tape off the area so that nobody can destroy evidence around the bodies. Fourth, and this is really a matter of crime scene management, emphasize disturbances. Any movements or alterations that are made by SAR personnel in the scene should be meticulously recorded. As Fundamentals of Search and Rescue notes, failure to do this could result in being suspect of acting beyond one's authority or even destroying evidence. So make sure to clarify what you did upon entering the scene and why that was necessary. And then finally, remain on the scene until official help arrives. Don't abandon that scene. Instead, send somebody else to do that. Finally, don't search for the deceased identity. The responsible authorities are the ones that will carry out this task. Always try to have a witness to any activity you are involved with at the scene of a death, and protect your own interests, because everyone must be considered as suspect until criminal intent is ruled out. In summary, we look for clues as well as a subject because clues eventually will lead to the subject, and there are more clues than there are subjects. Handle any clue as if it were the only piece of evidence. Consider each discovery to be absolutely important until proven otherwise. And then, overall, establish clear search guidelines prior to going out and searching. Plan for handling of specific evidence in the briefing. Generate an accurate record of evidence. Understand the chain of evidence. Engage in good clue consciousness. Treat injuries first, but be mindful of any evidence. And this completes the clue awareness, evidence, and ground search theory presentation. There will be an associated multiple choice and true-false quiz, but hopefully you can take these and apply them to our scenario and training on clue searches that will be coming up soon. Thanks for listening.